We're going to turn to an organization from my country. We're going to turn to USTDA and Lydia Fitz, who's Regional Director responsible for Sub-Sahara Africa. And that's the U.S. Trade and Development Agency. So Lydia, my question for you is, as you evaluate how you deploy USTDA resources to infrastructure projects in Africa, please help us understand your whole process. What are your risk classifications, your mitigation process, your criteria for allocations, and share your view on the role that institutional investors can play as an anchor, as seed players in the establishment of platforms that deliver on both domestic and regional Africa infrastructure projects. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's really an honor to be on this panel with so many experts, and a lot of the things I wanted to say I think have already been said. But just to reiterate, I'm Lida Fitz from U.S. Trade and Development Agency, which is the U.S. government's project preparation facility. We've been around for about 30 years, funded somewhere between 500 and 600 projects in Africa. And when I look at how we look at risk, how we look at projects, I'd say it's changed a lot in the last few years. We've changed how we look at projects as our portfolio has changed. And as Alex so kindly mentioned, we have expanded a bit. In fact, we have grown about 350% for the last 4 years for our Africa investments. And it's actually our biggest portfolio now in the agency for 3 years running. We expect this year for Africa investments to be the biggest regional investments that USTDA has ever made. So our largest portfolio in our agency's history. And that's not a policy decision. That's because there's an increase in good projects. There is an increase in demand. There's an increase in interested investors in putting money in. In our last project call for project proposals, we got 300 proposals just for energy projects. It's a significant increase from the one we had done just 6 months before. And we saw demand come from across the continent. And so we needed to adjust to that. We also needed to adjust because 5–10 years ago, most of our portfolio were public sector projects. And now 90% of what we invest in is private sector led. So that also required us to adapt a little bit. But at the end of the day, how we look at a project is probably not very different from how the rest of this panel looks. And I think that that's one thing that sometimes probably no one in this room, but greener developers don't understand, is that a project preparation investment is going to ask almost all the same questions that a financier would ask. We accept less defined answers, perhaps, but we don't accept, we'll figure that out in the feasibility study. And so we look at, you know, how much experience does this developer have for similar projects? That comes up a lot as one of our bigger issues. And then, of course, you know, the rate of return, the clarity that this project is in the government's interests and priority list, that there is a regulatory regime and policy regime that is accepting of the way that this is structured. And for that matter, you know, looking at what financiers' response to that is. And it used to be that you started having conversations with financiers, you know, only once you had your study in hand, you know, shopped it all around. But now those conversations start really at the beginning stages of project development. So we're also talking to financiers who've already expressed interest in the project, make sure that we understand their rationale and are aligned. And we've developed more partnerships with financiers because of that. So we've a formal partnership with DBSA, with IDC in South Africa. We work very closely with AFDB, we do some co-financing or project prep with NEPAD IPPF, with DBSA. We partner with OPIC, but those conversations to make sure that when we are putting money in, that there's somebody on the other side that if, as we all anticipate, the numbers come out good, that the government doesn't change its approach to the sector, to this project in the intervening time, that there'll be a financier ready and willing to take it up on the other side. And there's a great appetite for bankable projects. I know Mo said something similar, and we hear that all the time. And the challenge is making sure that what you bet on it as bankable at the beginning of the process comes out and still is on the other side. And you asked me about what role anchor investors can play in platforms. And I think that there are two things that platforms overall it could deliver for the market that would make things faster and better. One is just the repetition. We see a lot of success from developers who do now have a track record of developing the same sort of project in multiple countries. They can go faster and have more return. But platforms that could develop different types of projects within the same country so that you don't have to rebuild the relationships, rebuild these standard practices again and again. There could be certainly an advantage there. So many of the projects that we look at are first time ever projects. This is the first on-grid solar, or this is the first off-grid, or this is the first private sector approach to a port. Anytime you're doing something for the first time, it takes a long time. So you're looking at 12 to 15 years and you're trying to whittle that down, but everything is the first. So if there are platforms that will allow us to come to more repetition, that would save time. And then I would love to see, some of the investors have some leverage with what I think is one of our biggest challenges in the market, which is the amount of change and to some extent non-transparency in the overall enabling environment, whether it is the regulation that has changed or whether it is the approach to procuring infrastructure that has changed during the development, or whether there's been an election and now that it's no longer a favored project. We recently did an exercise where we looked across our portfolio, and we have 72 active projects in Africa right now, what we've invested in. And we said, of these projects, what's the biggest delay? What's causing them to not reach, what the timeline that the developer initially told us? Well, of course, first of all, the developers are always very optimistic. But apart from that, what slows things down? And it is a host of things, but the biggest issue that came up were market changes, assumptions that had changed since the beginning of the project, whether it was a tariff, whether independent project IPPs had been welcomed and now we're moving to competition, whether the tariff had been set and now it is changing, whether there had been clear government approval, but now there's a new government. So something where they had diligenced this to begin with, and now there's a new set of assumptions. And these projects are not non-bankable, but they are slowed down. Yeah. As Mo said, bankable projects in unbankable environments, that just adds to the overall expense. And that makes us more necessary. Every year additional development costs, the more you need a grant to help you get over the line with a rate of return that is still attractive to investors. So it would give us ability to make much quicker decisions because we spend a fair amount of time diligencing markets that are not clear and trying to get a handle on that. If that was clear, we would be able to make faster development decisions, faster investment decisions. At the same time, fewer people would even need our assistance because it would bring the cost of that development down. So I think that that's an issue for projects, and larger investors, specifically institutional investors, have some heft and ability to exert their leverage in some of these markets to note that there are a lot of wins for the market and decreased infrastructure costs from having a very static set of rules.
Yeah, no. Again, so important being able to manifest the political will and make sure that that helps create the consistency in the environment. And how do we work with our friends in the development community, like you and others?
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.